Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of our history course, which has to do with the politics and economics of slavery in the United States. It's a topic that we cannot avoid when talking about the origins of the United States because slavery was such a huge part of it. So let's get to this slide here. This is the contextual slide that I would always show in class, and I'll show it to you here. And I'm just going to read through it with you and explain it. So cotton, as we see in the first bullet point, makes up for 1/2 of the entire U.S. economy by 1830. One thing to keep in mind is that the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which is already underway, helping to turn Britain into a superpower, it has been underway since the late 1700s, and the Industrial Revolution in the United States, which will get started right after the Civil War, those industrial revolutions that will turn Britain into a superpower and the United States one day into a superpower was based originally off of cotton textiles. That means that you need to have the raw goods of cotton that you can take and turn into cotton cloth. And cotton cloth was used for so much. There's such a worldwide demand that cotton is something that people are really going to be, well, let me put it this way. The other cloth that people could use that was commonly available was wool. I want you to imagine wearing wool in the summer versus cotton in the summer. Which would you prefer, for instance? Okay. Also, you didn't want to use wool for things like sails for ships, whereas cotton worked great for sails for ships, and jeans for gold miners and laborers and all that over in the West. They're not going to want to wear wool pants, although they've had to. They would much rather prefer to wear cotton pants. Okay, so cotton is this massive, massive product that's going to be really important in the United States as we move into the middle of the 1800s. So slavery was on the decline earlier on, before the 1830s, because it was so hard to harvest cotton. And then this guy named Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, and you'll see that video in a moment. The cotton gin is going to revolutionize how easy it is to actually make cotton, because cotton was hard to pick. And with the cotton gin, you could pick cotton and process cotton very quickly.
In the South, tobacco was the main cash crop in the 18th century. Raising tobacco is very labor intensive, which created a demand for slaves. But toward the end of the 18th century, the tobacco market began to decline. As the southern plantation owners grew less tobacco, fewer slaves were required, which caused a drop in the price of slaves. Many people anticipated a future without slavery in America. But all of this changed with the invention of the cotton gin in 1783. Eli Whitney was an inventor who focused primarily on reducing the cost of manufacturing by making rifles with interchangeable parts. On a boat to South Carolina, he met the widow of Nathaniel Greene, a famous general in the American Revolution, and was invited to come to her house. While there, he learned of the problems associated with growing cotton. Cotton was not grown very often because its production was very labor intensive. In addition to the usual labor to produce a crop, in cotton, the seeds needed to be separated out so that it could be used as a fiber to make fabric. This was a very time-consuming process, and workers could only clean about 1 pound of cotton a day. There was a rising market for fibers for fabric because of the growth in the textile industry, both in America and in the North. With the amount of labor required, cotton was not cost-effective, so wool was used instead. After Whitney was told about these problems, he was asked to try to invent a machine to automate the cleaning process. His resulting machine, the cotton gin, short for engine, was able to produce 50 pounds a day, the work of 50 men. The machine was not as successful for Whitney. His patent was ignored and his machine copied, and his cotton gin company went out of business because of the costs of legal battles to enforce his patent. The cotton gin had a huge impact on the South. Cotton went from being an expensive product to produce to a very profitable venture. The South's climate and soil was suited to cotton, so once the cotton gin was invented, much of the South switched to its production to fill the mills of England and the North. With the new viable cotton market, the demand for slaves was reignited, along with the desire to keep the institution. Because of the high worldwide demand for cotton, new fields were cleared and planted, and this required more unskilled labor, which the slavery system provided. Even though the cotton gin reduced the labor involved, it actually increased the work for slaves. Now that there were mass producing cotton, they still needed slaves to plant and cultivate the cotton and to pick it once it was ripe. Cotton worked well with corn because the picking and planting times were different. So when the slaves were done planting corn, it was time to plant cotton. When they were done harvesting corn, they harvested the cotton. Because of the costs associated with producing wool, the cotton gin did not decrease the price of cotton. Even though it became much easier to produce, the demands from Britain and New England rose. Soon the South began to rely so much on cotton as their cash crop, they began to call it King Cotton. The South produced 75% of the cotton in the whole world. They believed that if the North attacked them, Britain would come to their aid, because without their cotton, English industries would collapse, and those industries would put pressure to support the South. It didn't end up turning out as they had hoped and expected.
So one thing to know is that with slavery being so important by 1830, now this is important. Slavery was slowly on the way out until the cotton gin comes along and the worldwide cotton market became so big. And so now you need slaves to work the cotton gins to make the cotton for the industrial revolutions happening in England and soon in America. Well, here's one big problem with supply of labor. In 1809, the United States is going to bow to international pressure from England and France. Both of those countries have abolished their slave trade. So what that means is that if the United States wants to trade with England and France, the United States also needs to abolish the importation of slaves from Africa. Now, the United States is not going to abolish the American slave system because there's just too much money in slavery in America. So the United States will keep slavery going for as long as it can. However, new slaves coming from Africa are banned. What this means is that slaves in the United States are now more valuable. You can only get slaves legally from U.S. plantations where slaves are born, and therefore those slaves are going to cost more. To put it into perspective, let me say it like this. You can get a dog, a purebred dog, from the pound maybe. But if you go to the shelter, to the pound, you don't really know if it's a purebred dog. You don't know if that dog is show quality. You don't know if that dog is going to be able to have all the genetic qualities that you want out of a purebred dog, or horse, or any other animal that you might be considering. Same thing with slaves in this horrible economy. But the deal is that if you go to a breeder that has documentation and has a reputation, then that dog is going to cost you a lot more money than going to a shelter, but you're entirely aware of whether or not that dog is a purebred and has all the genetic qualities that you want, so that you can take that dog and use it for shows or use it for some kind of work that you have set up for it, or whatever it is. So I guess the point is that slaves born in the United States were worth a lot more money because there was a history to those slaves and records of those slaves. Whereas slaves being brought in from Africa, although you had to break those slaves and train those slaves and the whole deal, they were still much cheaper. By expense, I want to say that in modern US dollars, a single slave was somewhere around the worth. A male slave in 1830 could go for somewhere in modern US dollars between $40,000 to $60,000. So slaves were something rich people got, not normal people, okay? And a female slave could go from somewhere between $40,000 to $80,000. It really depended on what she looked like, the color of her skin, and whether she could bear more slaves that looked like her. Okay, so female slaves were often worth more than male slaves, and that value simply goes up. Look at the economy based on slavery as we go into the 1820s. 2 million domestic slaves sold. Now, there were over 5 million slaves in the United States, but 2 million people sold at the value, during this period of time, that valued between $40,000 to $80,000. Just think about how much money in the economy that's taxable we're talking about. Okay, so cotton might have been a big economy, but slavery was a big economy too. Okay, well, now we're going to look at this, ladies and gentlemen. This is the map of the United States just before we get to the Mexican-American War and the Texas War of Independence and all these things happening over here in the West. So we've got the northern states. These are largely non-slave states, although some of them did have slaves in them. And then you've got the southern states, and these states are all openly slave states, okay? And then you've got the Arkansas Territory, which is being considered a slave state. Texas will eventually join the United States as a slave state. What about Missouri, though? Missouri, you notice, is kind of jutting up like a tooth carved in a pumpkin up into the north, right? It seems weird because there seems to be a kind of a line here of northern states that do not have slaves, and then suddenly there's Missouri in 1821. Well, what happened here, folks, to make it a shorter story, is that Missouri wants to join the country as a slave state in 1821. There's going to be trouble with this because before Missouri wanted to join the country, there was an equal number of people that lived here in the north as there was that lived in the more rural slaveholding south. What I mean by that is way over here in Washington, D.C., there were about as many representatives that were pro-slavery as there were anti-slavery. And there was a gag rule on where people, whenever slavery came up as a topic in the United States, it turned into a big argument, much like what you see on social media when people argue about conservative values versus liberal values, or whether you should reopen states during the COVID crisis or not, or whatever it is, some kind of big deal, pro or anti-Trump policies. It doesn't matter, right? It is just the polarizing kind of topic where nobody ever wins, but they just argue and argue and argue and scream at each other. So in Congress, what happened was that there was all the delegates that came from the North and all the delegates that came from the South, so that they can get business done, agreed to a gag rule which said that slavery was simply not a topic they were going to talk about in Congress. It was just going to be a thing that the states handled on their own, states' rights, and the federal government would simply not get involved in it. And so if you were in Congress, you were not supposed to talk about slavery because it was such a hot button issue between the moral New Englanders, the uncaring northern farmers, and then, of course, the greatly defiant Southerners. So what happens is in 1821, Missouri joins the country as a slave state, which gives more delegates that are pro-slavery in D.C. There was a balance, a very interesting balance that kept the arguments down between the slave states and the free states, which was that neither group had more power than the other until Missouri joined in 1821, giving more power to the slave states in Congress. And so to make this work, what's going to happen is you're going to have a compromise. So you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of arguing like this. What are you going to do when a slave state joins the country and you unbalance the system? And the answer, and we'll talk more about this later, is you're going to add a free state. So there's this model where you add two states at a time. This is called the Missouri Compromise. Again, we'll talk about this in a minute. So Southern slave owners, obsessed with keeping a feudal society of honor and pride in the South among the wealthy people. If you were a slave owner, you also had a plantation that was kind of like a medieval manor house of a noble in medieval Europe. And so you basically had a society based on that medieval European concept, and you liked it. You liked the idea of being treated like a noble, and your slaves were your serfs and gave you all that wealth through their labor. And then your family was well provided for and did things that rich people did and had this whole economy. And slave owners often viewed themselves as protectors of poor, child-minded humans who needed guidance. Basically, the idea was that American racism had turned people who were of Africa into the kind of people who were in American culture considered to be subhuman, people who were basically like children who needed to be taught morality and taught how to be humans. And what better way to do that? My dog says hi. What better way to do that than to, put them on a slave plantation, right? Welcome to America. Okay, I want to show you this. This is George Fitzhugh. George Fitzhugh is a guy that is the apologist for slavery. He's a person that talks about why, as America gets into a greater debate about slavery from the 1830s to the 1850s, he writes lots of books about why slavery is so important in America, and he talks about why slavery is justified. And these arguments that he's going to make are very awful, all right? These are arguments that everybody, even anti-slavery advocates back in the 1800s, wouldn't argue with him that much. But of course, if you make these arguments today, I hope people see that as being absolutely nuts, okay? So it's a different society that we live in today, thank God, when it comes to slavery. Um, this guy here, George Fitzhugh, he basically makes a lot of arguments about slavery being something that includes all forms of labor. Everybody's a slave if they work for someone else in some context, trying to make slavery sound better, I guess. He considers slavery to be way better, that people on slave plantations were treated way better than they were in his estimation in the factories of New England or over in Britain. I think that both had their horrible aspects to it. I don't remember hearing about Irish or Italian immigrants being flogged or put in hot boxes. So like they did on plantations, but whatever. In the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, it was very common to believe that slave plantations were places where slaves were treated well, and you're in this feudal system that everybody thought was kind of neat and honorable in some way, and that slaves were people who were treated better than people who were treated in factories. It's just sort of a system of belief that Southern people had when it came to slavery. George Fitzhugh is going to be famous for writing this book, Cannibals All. Cannibals All is a book that is going to be common reading in America into the 1850s. Cannibals All is a book that talks about how slaves were of Africa, and African-based slaves were essentially of cultures who, if they were not taught morality or not taught an education somehow through being slaves and slowly evolved into better people, that they would simply be cannibals. They would eat each other and descend into some kind of savagery. And he says that everybody in Africa is like this. And of course, George Fitzhugh never went to Africa. This is just a very American way to look at Africa. And obviously it's pretty messed up. There's George Fitzhugh, one of many rich white people in the South. They all kind of look the same, big shock of white hair like this and hawkish eyes. These rich guys who own slaves in the South, all right? And I'm only talking about George Fitzhugh because we don't have enough time to talk about everybody. But he was the one big spokesman that everybody talked about and said, see, George Fitzhugh said that, and therefore it must be true, okay? So here's some quotes from this guy, George Fitzhugh, that might be useful for you to know, and it's going to be on the final too. What are some arguments that people had to support slavery? Well, here's one that George Fitzhugh puts in his book. The Negro, he says, is improvident, will not lay up in summer for the wants of winter, will not accumulate in youth for the exigencies of age. What does this mean? It means that if you're black, you are improvident, unable to plan for the future. Okay, for what winter needs. You're not able to get the food together and the stockpiles of lumber and that sort of thing, right? You will not save up in your youth for the needs of old age. That's all this means. He would become, therefore, an insufferable burden to society. The black person would essentially become a welfare child, and therefore society has the right to prevent this and can only do so by subjecting the African into domestic slavery here in America. This is a very commonly believed thing. Even people, again, who were anti-slavery often believed that African Americans were, may not have deserved to be slaves, but they believed that African Americans were not as smart as whites. I mean, that was very common. Okay, this kind of racism in America. Then he goes on to say this kind of thing. We presume the maddest abolitionist, an abolitionist is someone who is anti-slavery, we presume the maddest abolitionist does not think the Negro's providence of habits and money-making capacity at all to compare with those of the whites. This defect of character would alone justify enslaving him. That's pretty self-explanatory in that horribly racist view, but very commonly believed at the time. Basically meaning that if you're black, you have not the mentality to compete with white people in the free market. And therefore, why would you let people out there, who are black have markets, stores and businesses? Because they're just going to always fail and screw up the economy. That's a belief that a lot of people had back in America in the 1800s. In Africa or the West Indies, a black person would become idolatrous, a savage and cannibal, or be devoured by savages and cannibals. At the North, he would freeze or starve. Now, you might look at these quotes and think, wow, who the heck would believe stuff like this? And at the same time, when you turn on the TV or the radio or look at Facebook, you see people that believe all kinds of crazy things, right? Just because they heard it from a certain news station or from a talk show host somewhere, and they just believe without doing any fact checking at all, right? Well, that's what this is. People haven't changed since the 1800s, people still often fall into the herd category where they just kind of, a certain group of people just believe whatever people tell them, right? And that's kind of what this is. Okay. How about the anti-slavery movement? Early attempts at trying to get rid of slavery. I need to be real clear. If you were anti-slavery, it was often because you didn't believe with how slaves were treated, and it was often that you did not believe that slaves should be kept from education or kept from the Bible, meaning kept from church. You might believe that slaves should be laborers, but they should be allowed to at least be treated as basic citizens. You did not necessarily believe, if you were an abolitionist, that slaves were people who could be suddenly free, equal citizens with everybody. Okay, even President Lincoln did not believe that African Americans should be completely equal with whites, and we'll talk about that in a while. So let's keep that in mind. All right, if you're an abolitionist, you're not some kind of modern American living back in the 1800s. You are still a product of your time. You're still probably fairly racist compared to modern day ideals, but you still want to end slavery. You still get that there's a problem with it, whatever that is. So what about slavery? Northeastern states, often born out of Puritanism, were religiously opposed to slavery, and these are the only guys that actually ended slavery on religious grounds. They still made money from slavery, though. A lot of the Puritans owned the ships that actually carried slaves to and from Africa to America, and carried the tobacco and cotton from slave plantations back to Europe. So although these guys might be morally opposed to slavery, they often make money from the slave system. Okay, so they're not going to try to end it all that harshly until it gets much later in the history. They made textiles. The early factories in the United States actually were in New England, and those factories are going to get their textiles from cotton, right? The cotton comes from slaves in southern plantations, so there's a link there. I want to give you an example, a company that still exists today, Brooks Brothers, in New York City. They make clothes for slaves, all right? So this is a middle state that did not have a lot of slavery in it, and there were a lot of anti-slavery advocates in New York, but there's a company in New York that actually makes clothing for slaves in the South, that slave owners would buy and give a cheap suit of clothes to their slaves once a year or whatever. In Midwestern states, these are small family farms of people that have moved west, and they are so far removed from slave culture from the East Coast that they don't really care. They don't have an opinion about slavery. So if you're not going to see people that are trying to end slavery able to talk to these guys much, because these guys moved west just to get away from everything in the East. They're on small farms. They're living in Ohio, or they're living in the new Arkansas or the Kansas territory, maybe in the gold fields of California. And the last thing they want to do is have a debate about slavery. These guys all have small farms and small businesses where the families operate things as opposed to slaves. So you're not going to be able to talk to these guys too much for a while. How do you convince these dudes to want to care about slavery and maybe vote against it one day? It's going to be a huge problem. Okay. So although up here you've got these people who are anti-slavery, they're still making money from slavery, and therefore it's kind of tough to get them all to get on board with trying to end it. You've got these guys who occupy the farming states of the West, and they just kind of don't care for a long time. And then you've got the South, and in the South is where you've got the slave system. So of course these guys don't want to end slavery, right? The people that did not own slaves believed in the system of rights, of states' rights to actually have slaves or not to have slaves. So this is America as we're moving in towards the 1840s, which is a greatly divided, large nation already, where it's really hard to find a way to get people to not want slavery, because how do you convince people to care, right? How do you get them to want to get rid of slavery? We'll talk more about this. What are some of the things that anti-slavery, that abolitionists that want to abolish slavery, what are some of the things that these guys want to do to try to convince people that live in all these areas to get rid of slavery? One, you publish books on the hypocrisy of slavery. For instance, you help with the Underground Railroad, you help to free slaves that managed to run away and escape. And then you publish their stories as documentaries about their lives in slavery, and then publish those books. You know who's going to read those books? Mostly these guys. They publish the books and they read the books. Middle-class former Puritans that live up in New England, they read these books. The same people that write them read them. It's that cognitive dissonance issue, okay? You know who doesn't read these books? Everybody else. It's kind of like this, you guys, and I don't mean to insult anybody or offend anyone, but it goes like this. Depending on how much time you have a day after work and after school and after doing all your chores, the problem with documentaries is that very few people are going to spend the 1 or 2 hours that they might have free each day, or even more hours, to sit down and watch on their own without being told to do it for a grade or something, to watch a documentary on the Holocaust, like the Armenian genocide or the Jewish Holocaust in Nazi Germany and everything that happened there, right? How many people just go, I'm going to make myself a sandwich and sit down and watch a movie about the Holocaust. I can't wait, right? Well, the slave system was a Holocaust, but people had other things to do than immerse themselves in the Holocaust of American slavery. It was easier for them to basically ignore it, right? Just kind of let it happen, and maybe one day it'll change, or the government will make a law, or something will happen, right? And so the deal is that anti-slavery people, they put out books and pamphlets and preached in churches, but the only people that read those books were people that already believed in the same thing. So it was preaching to the choir, literally, most of the time. Okay. Sometimes they publish gruesome pictures in national newspapers of slaves being tortured. That had some effect, but not enough. Okay. So the deal is that how are you going to reach people that are too busy to care about fighting to free slaves? How do you reach them? What do you do? And that brings me to an amazing event, okay? That brings me, before I get there, this is Frederick Douglass. He's a man himself that escaped slavery in Georgia and makes it up to the north, and he becomes very literate, and he writes books about his life as a slave. You could read them online. His books are available. He becomes a politician. He's a very famous guy, Frederick Douglass. But the only people for a long time that really listened to him were people who supported him, meaning Eastern Northerners. Okay, so there's going to be a moment that happens in the the middle of the 1840s to the late 1840s. Something amazing happens that starts to get people to care, meaning an abolitionist figures out what to do. Harriet Beecher Stowe is the pen name for someone. This is not her real name. I'll let you look that up and find out what the real name of the author is. Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's hard to tell with this name, knowing American names, of the period. It's hard to tell whether this person was white or black or anything in between, okay? Harriet Beecher Stowe is a very ambiguous name when it comes to ethnicity in this country, especially in the 1800s. And she's going to write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe actually came from New England. And she moved all the way into a Midwestern state. I think it was Wisconsin. I could be wrong about that. But she moved into a Midwestern state so that she could write a book, and more than one, about the horrors of slavery without anybody automatically knowing that she was coming from New England. Because if there was a book published by somebody in New England, 9 times out of 10, it was going to be a documentary about the horrors of slavery. So she wanted to be read, so she moved away. She changed her name and moved out of New England so that she could publish books in a Midwestern state. Now, what she's going to do is she's going to write this book, and she does it in a very creative way. This is a book that definitely is about the horrors of slavery, but it is a fictional book. It's not a documentary, okay? It's a fictional book. So it's like if you go to watch Django Unchained. You've got a fictional story that is an interesting, exciting story, but it's in the backdrop of the American slave system, all of which is very accurate. In fact, it's hauntingly accurate. It's one of my favorite movies when you want to look at scenes in modern cinema of slavery in America. It's amazingly well done. Yet the actual people involved, the actual characters, are fictional, and they're driving the story along. So even if you don't want to watch a documentary about the horrors of slavery, you can watch a movie like Django Unchained and get the idea, sort of, right? Kind of a popcorn style, a spaghetti western, style of story, while being given the story of the backdrop of American slavery. Let me put it like that. And so that's what this is. All right. This is very much that kind of deal, a fictional story that brings you in. But how are you going to get people in the Midwest, in California, and down in the Arkansas territory or what have you. How are you going to get people to actually pick this book up and read it when they've got other choices? They've got fun books like Huck Finn books from Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer books from Mark Twain, and all the books I really know from the period are from Mark Twain. So Mark Twain books. Well, the deal is, guys, is that Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very mischievous work. Okay, what happens is the first chapter of the book, the first chapter that you might read when you open this book up, is really an introduction to the story of this little girl and her father and this guy named Uncle Tom. And you don't get to these stories until you get a few chapters in. So let's say you open the book up to read the first chapter in the bookstore to decide if you want to buy this book. And what you're going to learn is about this little girl who's kind of sad because her mother died of a disease, nothing uncommon at the time. And her father's gone a lot, who's, in the house. Her father's gone a lot because he's doing business. This is a slave plantation. And because people like to believe that slaves were treated nice on slave plantations, Uncle Tom's Cabin starts with the slaves being treated nicely on the slave plantation. Uncle Tom is almost like a free man the way he's treated with his family on this plantation, and Uncle Tom is kind of a caretaker. He's like a mentor for this young girl. He helps to raise her, and he's this kind of wise old man who takes care of this girl. And really the gateway to this story, the reason why white people picked this book up to read it, is because it was sold as kind of a adventure drama, and this girl was the gateway. You have this little white girl, and she's the way that people will, a key for why they would even read this book, because it was just about Uncle Tom. There's no way they're going to read this book. But if it's about her and Uncle Tom as a side character, then of course, right? So this book is purchased by people who learn that what happens is the first chapter is that the father of this little girl comes home and says, we're having trouble making money. There's a recession that's starting. We're going to have to sell some of our slaves. I'm so sorry. One of those slaves has to be Uncle Tom. We're just going to have to sell him, and we'll try to get him back as soon as we can. I'm so sorry. And of course, there's the scene of the heartbroken little girl losing her Uncle Tom, who has to be sold into slavery. And so you begin the scene where it's just kind of like this sad story of an economic downturn, and it's not really about the horrors of slavery yet. And then people buy the book, because the story that people think is really going to happen here is that they're going to go home and read the story of how this little girl is going to go find Uncle Tom, who has been sold into slavery, and bring him home. That's the novel, right? That's the promise. And so you buy the book, you take it home, and the next thing you know is Uncle Tom is sold into slavery, and you start to learn, even though you didn't want to learn this stuff, how bad things really were on slave plantations. So all the stories that Harriet Beecher Stowe tells about Uncle Tom being beaten and Uncle Tom being manipulated and Uncle Tom's family, who were also sold into slavery, his sisters and his father being sold into slavery and being beaten and killed and all these things happening, you're now stuck reading those things if you want to find out what happens, because in American storytelling, you have to have a happy ending more than not. And the happy ending is supposed to be this little girl who, over the course of several years, finds and brings home Uncle Tom, who is going through hell in the American slave system that people are now reading about, because it's now a fiction novel, and they're being introduced to how bad slavery really is, even though they didn't expect to have that happen to them. Okay, in the end, you guys, the story is amazing. In the end, you go through a couple of years of just absolute horror. And in the end, the little girl finds Uncle Tom. And Uncle Tom is bleeding and beaten and lying in a barn 2 plantations away, where he's been sold twice. And she finally tracks him down. And Uncle Tom is unable to move. He's been treated so sorely, so badly. And she gets to him and says, Uncle Tom, we're here to bring you home, Uncle Tom. We finally found you. And the very last page of the book is Uncle Tom looking at her and smiling, and then he dies. And that's it. That's the book. And so people have been brought through the horrors of slavery when they read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which means that people are kind of pissed. All right. They're really pissed off about this. And this book, this one book creates a social dialogue about slavery that until this time was only up in New England. And all of a sudden it's all over the country. Within 2 years, this book is converted into or translated into 23 different languages. It becomes an international bestseller. People are judging Americans who travel abroad on this book. Based on the story of this book, they can't believe that America is this terrible to people. You know, human rights violations left and right. You know, the story gets out. Of course, slave owners like George Fitzhugh will say that this book is all just false, that it's fake news, so to speak, right? But the story is out, and people will actually start reading. Now, for the first time ever, people will go to the bookstores and start reading about this guy or about the other slaves who escaped. They'll start to read the documentaries to see if this is real because they can't believe it. And so the wool is pulled from their eyes, and part of that is due to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay? It has a crazy effect at the time. So let's get back into politics. We talked about society. Okay, society is just sort of, you know, why do people believe that slavery was okay? Well, economy and of course racism. Okay, we go over here. How do anti-slavery people try to end slavery? Well, they put out the documentaries that no one reads, and everybody just kind of ignores it until you start getting this sort of thing, like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, which is hugely popular. So what happens now? Okay, as we move into the 1840s, anti-slavery becomes a bigger issue. And Congress is being forced to talk about it more than they want to talk about it. It gets kind of violent at times in Congress. Well, let's get to politics now, for sure, okay? This very uncomfortable looking image is essentially the American government. This is basically the president. The job of the president is to keep the balance, all right? The job of the government is to keep the balance. Pro-slavery, anti-slavery, they all have to be balanced, because if this scale of pro or anti-slavery, if the status quo is upset, you're going to have a war. There's no way to avoid it. And so from the 1820s, really, all the way into the 1850s, you have this balance being very carefully kept by the government. There's a much bigger story to this, of course. And here's that balance if you want to see it by the names. You know, free states versus slave states in 1850. We have this, right? New York, New Jersey, we go all the way down. And these are all the free states before the 1820s. Here's all the slave states before the 1820s. And then after 1820, you've got free states and slave states. And then finally, the one state that screws it all up is California, because California joins with about 200,000 voters, and there's no state in the South that has that many people in it that can join and therefore keep the balance. So by 1850, the balance is over, and we're going to be going into a civil war. There's no way to get out of it. So let me take you to this. Remember where we were talking about Missouri? Missouri, yeah. There's two compromises to talk about. There's the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and there's the California Compromise. And we need to talk about those two things because they're largely about the politics of slavery when it comes to major events. So the Missouri Compromise is simply in 1820, Missouri applies for statehood. And the big question was, would Missouri be a slave state or a free state? I showed you that map earlier in the lecture. Well, the deal was the balance in Congress that we were just talking about. And so the compromise, the Missouri Compromise, is very simple. If a slave state wants to join the country, you have to add a free state like Maine. Or if a free state wants to join, you have to add a slave state. You have to add two at a time so that you keep the balance in Congress. That's really the way to solve the problem without having to solve the problem. Like, you know, do we keep or get rid of slavery? So the Missouri Compromise in 1820 is going to last until 1850, which is, you know, you add one state that's free, you must add another that's slave, or vice versa. The other part of the Missouri Compromise is just that you will not allow slave states above the 3630 parallel. Gosh, can I do this real fast? Make you dizzy. The 3630 parallel, which is part of the Missouri Compromise, whoa, there it was, right here, is there will be no slave states allowed in here above the 3630 parallel on the map. Missouri is added, but no other states up here will be added, which means if you want to keep slavery going, you got to keep moving into Mexican territory and start turning these states into slave states, which will happen a little bit. Okay, so going back, here we go. So that's the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now let's move to the California Compromise, which is the one that happens when California has that gold rush and wants to join the country. All right, so California, here we are, the Compromise of 1850. California wants to join as a free state, so it does. All right, but that unbalances Congress because now there's all these people that support a free America are going to be in Congress now, a few dozen of them. And so there's going to be a new rule. And that new rule is that popular sovereignty will now decide whether there will be slavery in future states. What is popular sovereignty? It's just a political science term that means vote. In America, from 1850 on, the government will no longer try to influence whether you have two or more slave or free states joining like you did with the Missouri Compromise. In 1850, when California joined, the government gave up trying to keep the balance and said, listen, any new states that want to join, they just get to vote. And they can vote to be free or slave, and the unbalanced will continue to be unbalanced, and at some point someone's going to have to solve it, but it's not us. Now, the obvious problem here is that when this happens, when popular sovereignty becomes the new rule to allow states to decide on their own if they want to be free or slave, what this means is that wherever there's new territories, there's going to be rich people from the north and from the south paying families to move to those new territories, and in return for a lot of money, those families will vote whether or not their states, like Kansas or Nebraska, will become a free state or a slave state. And so people are partisans now being sent to the West to go to states that will become the next states, and they'll either be free or slave states based on a vote. And that means there's going to be violence as these people are traveling along the same roads, and there's going to be an event even known as Bleeding Kansas, where there's some events where people actually fire at each other with their guns as they're traveling to Kansas, and some are paid to be pro-slavery and some are paid to be anti-slavery. It's just part of this idea that the vote will now count from 1850 on. This is going to be the beginning of a huge imbalance in Congress towards free states, which makes the southern states very unhappy and very defensive. Okay, here's something else that happens that is all in support of the free states. Slave trading is now prohibited in Washington, D.C. I should tell you this, in Washington, D.C., the biggest slave trading zone was actually right there, where the mall is, where it's that big lawn, that big long lawn that the Smithsonian museums surround, and is between the Washington Monument and the White House, that big lawn. That was the biggest slave auction site in the entire country. So people traveling to the United States from other countries would have to pass through very loud and raucous and smelly slave auctions just to get to Congress to do their business, right? That is a huge part of an embarrassment as we move into the 1850s for the United States. And so finally, slave trading is prohibited in the capital, which takes slave trading out of the capital, which is also an attack on the South. At least that's what the South thinks. And finally, to make the South happy, you're going to have strict fugitive slave laws. One of the biggest money killers in the South was slaves that ran away, that escaped through the Underground Railroad. And so there's going to be new slave laws that are actually going to force states to send escaped slaves back to slave states if those slaves made it up into the North. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850, California, it gets to be a free state, but now the balance is forever kind of screwed here when it comes to the balance of free versus slave states in America. Well, let's talk about these fugitive slave laws, because that's going to be a big part of the story. Right here, this is part of the fugitive slave laws, this part under the big and. Judges in all states are now forced by federal officials to immediately return escaped slaves to their states of origins. There were judges up in New England that would see cases where there's somebody from Georgia or South Carolina that comes to a judge that's up in Connecticut or something and says, hey, I found this escaped slave and I want to take him back to the slave's family in Georgia. And the judges, if they were anti-slavery, they might throw the case out and just find all kinds of reasons to not try the case. And so that was something the South really hated. And therefore, we have this new law that has federal authorities actually watching judges and overturning judges if judges should ever try a case where a captured slave who had run free was going to be sent back to the South. So judges are no longer able to basically free slaves in the North. And now there's bounty hunters. Bounty hunters are going to be paid to go up into the North and find slaves that have escaped. These might be people that escaped 20 years ago and thought that they were free now. But here's the problem. The kind of bounty hunters that are being sent into the South, into the North to find slaves, you guys, and these are bounty hunters paid by the federal government, okay, by U.S. taxes. Let me show you this. Here's a description of someone named Harriet Jacobs. This is the kind of description that bounty hunters are going to use. $100 reward, that's about $2,000 in modern money. $100 reward will be given, I'm just going to read this, for the apprehension and delivery of my servant girl, Harriet. She is a light mulatto, meaning lighter skinned black person, 21 years of age, about 5 feet 4 inches high, and of a thick and corpulent habit, meaning she has thick hair. Having on her head a thick covering of black hair that curls naturally, but which can be combed straight. She speaks easily and fluently and has an agreeable carriage and address, meaning that she looks pretty. That's all that means, an agreeable carriage and address. You guys, this is the description of somebody a bounty hunter has to go find. Guess what? If a bounty hunter can't find Harriet Jacobs but wants to make $2,000 or $100 in their money, wants to make a bunch of money, that bounty hunter just needs to find any girl that looks like this and say that she's Harriet and bring her to the South and force her into slavery. She could be a free girl born up in Massachusetts. And this happened. That movie, 12 Years a Slave, is based off of a real event where a free black person up in New England was kidnapped and sold and in lieu of someone else who had escaped a plantation years earlier. And that person was not the same person. But did the bounty hunter care? Of course not, because that bounty hunter is making money from both the state and federal government now, thanks to the fugitive slave law that is part of the Compromise of 1850. That's right. California joining as a state sets off this chain of events that is going to create a lot of panic and anger in America. Judges no longer able to see cases and free escaped slaves. Paid agents, bounty hunters that could just kidnap people really and bring them into the South as long as they look like the same person that escaped. This is a time of chaos now. There's a lot of anger up in the North and fear up in the North, especially amongst black people who are afraid of being captured and brought back into the South or being brought into the South, even if they had not been slaves in the first place. Okay? So the Underground Railroad is continuing. It's being well financed by a lot of people who are in. There are more and more people in America who are interested in ending slavery in America, and so the one way to do it is to make it financially difficult. And these are years. These are people who risk their lives to flee from their plantations in the South and find a way to get up into the North. Now, guys, the fugitive slave laws meant that if you got into the North, you were not free. So, of course, there were entire societies of people who were trying to find ways to change the identity of African Americans who escaped into the North. But this was not the most common way for slaves to rebel. This was just the most financially difficult. If a slave escaped, then a plantation just lost a $40,000 to $60,000 slave. So there were enough people running away that it was a financial hardship for the South. Harriet Tubman, who was voted to be put onto the $20 bill, even though that has yet to happen, to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. I just wanted to give you her name in case that ever happens. Harriet Tubman, of course, is famous for being one of the people that risked her life every day by helping slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. Okay. So, you know how I was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin and how people are are getting more and more angry about the issues of slavery in Congress, especially after California joins the country and upsets the balance, right? And so now people are arguing about slavery in Congress. Okay, it gets really bad. Well, this shows you how bad things are really getting. In 1859, there is a raid where a guy named John Brown, he was considered a terrorist by the South and a martyr by many in the North, okay? John Brown goes to Canada, creates a sleeper terrorist cell that is going to go down into Virginia. And in Virginia, this guy is going to basically take over an arsenal, a federal arsenal, a lightly guarded federal arsenal, and he's going to grab the guns with 20 other people, and they're going to take those guns and give them to slaves. He's going to try to be a Roman Spartacus. He wants to create a slave revolt. Here's his big famous quote. You know, if somebody puts something like this on Facebook, you should probably call the cops, all right, the FBI, and let them look into it. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. Which obviously means he's going to do something. And he goes up into Canada, creates a cell of people that have a plan. They all move into, slowly one by one, into Virginia. And then one day in 1859, they rise up, capture the small, sleepy town of Harper's Ferry, where there happens to be a factory that manufactures guns for the U.S. Army, and they try to arm slaves. The reality, guys, is that the slaves that live in the region had no idea this was happening, that this nutball was going to be grabbing guns and throwing them at them. And so the slaves, of course, didn't really rebel because they didn't know what to do. You know, nobody had warned them or trained them or prepared them for suddenly being given a gun by some white guy that was running by and said, you know, the revolution has begun or something like that, right? So obviously this doesn't work. He's captured by the U.S. Army for trying to incite a rebellion, and he's hung by the U.S. Army. Here's the deal, guys. Things are so bad that you now have partisans who are willing to start a civil war on their own, because they're so angry. That's where we are by the time we get to 1859. I want to show you this court case, which also was a huge issue in the 1800s, 1840s to 1850s. This is around this starts around the same time that Uncle Tom's Cabin came out and made slavery more of a national topic of discussion. Well, Dred Scott is a slave that was brought into Illinois. Illinois is a free state. He was brought in there by his master, and it was legal back then to bring a slave with you if you were from a southern state and you're going into a free state to do business. It was legal to bring a slave with you, but you had to declare that slave. You had to actually agree to leave that state within a certain amount of time because slavery was illegal in that free state, you know, that sort of thing. And so Dred Scott, that's just the name of the guy, of the slave. Dred Scott's owner brings him into Illinois to do business. Dred Scott's owner dies. And so now Dred Scott is left alone without any money or any way to get home back to the plantation where he's from in Georgia. So what happens? Well, abolitionists, anti-slavery lawyers from New England come down, they find Dred Scott, and they use him as kind of a pawn in the big game of trying to make slavery in a bigger issue in American politics. And so there's this big, a series really of big court trials that happens where the anti-slavery lawyers, all funded by wealthy people in the North, are basically putting this guy, you know, helping him go to trial, where they're arguing that since Dred Scott is a slave who has been left alone for more than a month in Illinois, he should be allowed to be free. Okay? So this is the issue. Dred Scott had traveled to a federal territory that Congress had declared a free state. Is Dred Scott free? That's the question, right? Now, here's the issue. It's going to get to the Supreme Court because every other court was unable to decide this one. It was too hot of a button topic, right? Because if any court decided that Dred Scott was free because he was left alone in a free state, you know what that means, guys? If the Supreme Court decides that Dred Scott is free because he was in a free state, it means that everybody that ever escaped from the South and made it into the North and are now alone without their slave owners in the North are now free. It means that the Fugitive Slave Act no longer is legal. So the Supreme Court has to be really careful about the Dred Scott case that they're finally going to argue in 1857. If Dred Scott is free because he was in a free state, then what that means is slavery, any slaves that escape and go to the North are now free no matter what. And if the Supreme Court decides this, trust me, the southern states will instantly leave the country and the Civil War will begin. And nobody on the Supreme Court wants to be the ones that started the Civil War. That's not what they want to be known for. So the deal is that the 9 justices of the Supreme Court are looking for any way possible to not decide the Dred Scott case, to throw it out. And they have to find an argument, and they finally do. And the end result, guys, is that what the Supreme Court does is they throw the case out, but they tick off everybody because the South wanted to see Dred Scott, wanted to see the Supreme Court send Dred Scott back to the South because a slave is always a slave as property. And of course, the North wanted to see Dred Scott freed because he was in a free state and therefore he should be free on that account. Well, the Supreme Court just does this. They say, because the Supreme Court doesn't want to make a decision at all, people of African descent were not citizens, and therefore they could not sue in court. That's all the Supreme Court says. They throw the case out. They say it's an invalid case. He is not a legal person, therefore he cannot sue in court. And so we have this happen. I should have done this backwards, right? I should have put this back there. This guy was so mad about the Dred Scott case and some other issues that he tries to start a civil war on his own. That's how bad things are getting. People are really getting partisan here, right? So there's the Stephen Douglas debates where Stephen Douglas and candidate Lincoln are arguing or debating with each other over the course of 1859, because at some point somebody is going to get elected president for the term of 1860. And so the election for that is in November of 1859. Now, you're going to read about Stephen Douglas and Lincoln, and you're going to do an assignment for me. But the end result is that Lincoln is going to be elected the president. And when he's elected president, he's elected as a president who has said in his debates how much he hated slavery. And so the South, who is already mad about this stuff, and the South that's already mad about this kind of stuff, and a South that in general is mad because there's fewer Southerners in Congress than there are Northerners now, a South that's really mad about this kind of stuff, right? The South is ready to go. The South wants to leave the country. And so when Lincoln is elected to the presidency, the South leaves. And here's what that looks like. Here's the North. Here's the South. All these green states are going to leave the country in 1860. And these gray states are going to be slave states, but they're going to tell Lincoln that they're going to stay in the country only if there's not a civil war, because they basically want to still be in the U.S. They just don't want to be in the U.S. if Lincoln is going to be what they consider a tyrant and start a war to keep the South in. And so what happens is when Lincoln starts to raise an army to fight the Civil War, to try to keep the South in the United States, when that happens, all these gray states are going to leave the country too. And so the last really story about that is that there's these states, this group of states here in Missouri. These guys basically say, listen, as long as we can be neutral, we're going to stay in the United States and we're not fighting, right? And in the end, they are going to fight. So the North is here, the South is here, and ladies and gentlemen, the Civil War will begin. So that's a very short, so brief, it's almost wrong, background of slavery in the United States. Thanks a lot.